Welcome to Blessors of Israel. I'm Georgene Rice. I serve on the board of directors, and I'm here with Pastor Rich Jones, who is the founder of Blessors of Israel. And it's our delight to be here today to talk about this settlement issue. If you've been following the headlines, you know that that is an issue that the world is talking about. And Pastor Rich, I'm hoping we can bring some clarity to this issue. What's happening? Why is it happening? And how important is it to the unfolding of God's purposes in the earth at this time?
And this issue of the West Bank settlements is very important to understand. It has, it's in the news, all the time. Although I think let's start with what are we talking about? West Bank settlements, meaning what? Well, settlements of the Israelis on the West Bank of the Jordan River. And so this area is really an area that has been the area controlled by the Palestinian Authority for many years. So I think, we really have to go back over the history to understand what brought us to this point and then look at the significance of what's happening today.
Well, let's start in 1948. When the Palestinians were given an opportunity to establish a territory for themselves, and Israel would have its own territory. That was rejected by the Palestinians. Take us from there to where we are today, where this territory is much fought over and negotiated about in terms of who has the right of ownership and residency.
Well, so you're right. You go back to 1948, the United Nations proposed a two-state solution, which is important to recognize that the Palestinian Arabs flatly rejected the offer of a Palestinian state, not wanting to concede anything to the Jews, to the Israelis. And so instead of accepting that solution, declared war. And then 5 Arab nations joined them in a war. And the result was what the Arabs call al-Nakba, which is the catastrophe. And in other words, the war was lost. Israel won, but as a result of that came refugees, Arab refugees, that many of them settled in that area of the West Bank, which was controlled by the nation of Jordan, because there was no Palestinian state, that was Jordanian. And so many refugees, if I recall right, I believe it was about 700,000 refugees that came out of the War of Independence. Some settled in Syria, Lebanon, Gaza Strip, but many of them in the West Bank. So that's where we really started the whole conflict, and the ensuing problem was that they moved from the areas, let's say, in Jaffa and other places to the north, and were settled into the West Bank. So that's where it started.
Now, I think for a lot of people, we wonder, why refugees? We're talking about 5 Arab nations. The Palestinians are Arab people. It's not a nationality. It's a people. Why were they not absorbed back into the Arab nations from which they had come? Why was there an expectation that they were entitled to not only occupy this area, but all of Israel? There was an expectation that they were given that they would ultimately return to the territory given to Israel because Israel would have been defeated.
Well, a lot of things there you mentioned. One, I think you mentioned that the assumption is that they would return or be absorbed into, rather, the nations from which they came. But they would say, look, we were living in that area. The Palestine area, ancient Israel, really, they were living in, which is true. They were living in those areas. But then when they declared war against Israel, these Palestinian refugees came out of the war zone. And a lot of the Arab nations, Palestinian Authority, which was a thing at the time, but the Palestinian leaders, let's say, it warned the Arabs living in there to leave. They told them to get out of the war zone so that there wasn't collateral damage. So there was no home countries to be absorbed into. So that's really kind of where the question of these refugees, why did they settle there? There was no home country. that was their land that they were living in already. So, I mean, I think that that's a legitimate claim. That was their land that they were living in, and so they settled in the West Bank. But it all changed in 1967. Mm-hmm. In 1967, Israel, in a preemptive strike against Israel, knowing that there would be a catastrophic war if they did not take action, defeated Egypt, Jordan, and Syria in 6 days. I mean, again, that was amazing. But the result of that is that now Israel controlled the West Bank, and now they've got control over these refugees. Now we've got a problem. So that's kind of how we got to where we are today, you might say.
Now, the question might be, why not absorb these refugees into the nation of Israel? There's a reason that was not the case, that Israel rejected that notion for their own national security. Can you explain why these refugees were not assimilated, both from the Israeli point of view and from the Palestinians who are now refugees?
Because they could have, right? I mean, that was an option. They could have been absorbed, let's say, into Israel proper. They could have just expanded the boundaries of the nation. But they did not want, in 1967, it would have, I don't know the number, but it would have been many hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs to absorb into the nation of Israel would have been an absolute security nightmare. Because you're talking about now an animosity and an hatred against Israel by hundreds of thousands of new citizens. I mean, it's unthinkable. And so even though it was debated, it was discussed, it was flatly rejected. So that was not an option. And interestingly, it's coming back up. That whole question is in the news recently. Is that still a possibility? And Israel would say, it is not. That is off the table. We are not going to absorb them into the nation proper. So I think, going back to the history, we had the 1948 war that brought about the Palestinian refugee problem. 1967 war, Six-Day War, Israel now, let's say, adopted the problem. They have control over that area that was once Jordan. Now it's all controlled by Israel. So that's, in many ways, how we got here. But now the problem grows, and that's really where we are today.
Well, let's talk about the settlements. We're referring to the West Bank. In Israel, it's referred to as Samaria, Judea. Can you explain the difference there and why it's important for Israel, or it at least seems to be important for Israel, to expand into these areas? I'm reminded in 2004, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon made a commitment that Israel would not go into these privately owned Palestinian areas. He made that agreement with President Bush at the time,
right.
That it would be illegal to do so. Now you're hearing from world leaders who say this is absolutely wrong.
Right.
Can you give us a bit of that history and why it's important now? Is this a provocation, or is this a legal action that's essential to the survival of Israel? How do you explain what's happening and how important it might be?
That is, I could break that down into about 5 topics because there is a tremendous amount of great insight and questions that are absolutely relevant to where we are today. Starting with, I think, one of the first things you mentioned, I'm referring to the area, and we've been referring to it as West Bank settlements. And in many ways, I am using a Western term. And many of the Israelis are offended when I use such a term. I'm using that term because it's commonly known as West Bank. But in Israel, they would refer to it as Samaria, Judea, which is what you were mentioning. And the reason they would refer to it as Samaria, Judea is because those are the ancient names of the tribes. Samaria was the capital city of Israel in the north. But Samaria and Judea would be, let's say, ancient Israel, designations of ancient Israel. And there is the insight to the problem of why the Israelis are settling into the West Bank, because there is a lot of pressure inside of Israel. There's a lot of conflict inside of Israel. You know, America's, as you know, is very divided. Well, right, we have far left, we have far right, a lot of pressures. Well, Israel is the same. There's a lot of pressures on the left, pressures on the right, and there's a lot of pressure to settle the area called the West Bank, or they call it Judea and Samaria, because they say that's Israel's land, that's ancient Israel, and there's a lot of pressure to say we ought to settle it and let Israel have rights to ancient Israel. But there's the conflict. There's what you brought up. The nations of the world, United Nations. In fact, I was just reading an article this morning. United States is strongly objecting to these settlements. And I understand. It is a conflict. And the United Nations has taken it up.
Yes.
And, of course, a lot of condemning Israel for these settlements. And in the news recently, there is a lot of conflict between now the settlers. The settlers themselves are engaging with the Palestinian Arabs, who, of course, are vehemently objecting to these settlements. So this conflict is going to be a conflict for quite some time. How is this going to end is a great question. And what bearing does it have on the two-state solution?
You know, interestingly, there's a political boundary and there is a biblical boundary, and the conflict between the two is really what we're talking about here today. What do you acknowledge as the nation of Israel as it exists today, as opposed to the boundaries that were set by God generations ago?
That is a huge question, and one that I think we should take on another podcast.
Absolutely.
Because, I mean, it is a deep question and very, very important. But I think, to wrap this up, the question has to do with, does this have any bearing on a solution? I mean, what is the solution? And I think the United States and United Nations and other nations of the world are saying these settlements are an obstacle to peace, and they are an obstacle to the two-state solution. And I think there's some justification for what they're saying there, but it really does come down to, will we have a two-state solution? Is that even viable?
Well, that's the question I was just going to ask you. Is it viable that there's a two-state solution from the Israeli point of view, and for that matter, from the Palestinian point of view? Have they ever seen a two-state solution as a direction that they're willing to go?
Well,
so this is a serious issue.
It is, and I would say yes, they have. In the past, there have been serious talks and opportunities for the Palestinian Arabs to have their own state. I think that would be a very interesting podcast as well. Every opportunity that they had, however, they rejected, and their demands are such that there's no negotiating stance there. It's not viable. And so today, you're asking, is that a viable solution? More and more and more, even the Palestinian Arabs are saying that's not a viable solution. Mm-hmm. I think the two-state solution seems to be, let's say, dying on the vine. So how is this going to be solved? The conflict in the Middle East? Well, I think in many ways it sets the stage for the latter days. As we've been saying, Israel will be the center of the unfolding of prophetic events, and it brings greater and greater pressure on the world to negotiate, and I think it sets the stage for an Antichrist.
Well, we're going to continue this conversation on another podcast because there's so much there that we could discuss. But I want to just tell you, if you'd like to receive the latest news concerning Israel with biblical commentary, please visit our website at www.blessors.org, and that's spelled with an O, blessors.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Getter, and please subscribe to our YouTube and Rumble channels where you can get more of this kind of commentary. We also appreciate your prayers and ongoing financial support as we build this new ministry. Thanks again for joining us, and remember, those who bless Israel will be blessed. Shalom.